The drummers had already started when Emeka stepped into the hall, and not one of the 300 guests turned to look at him. That was the first thing he noticed, and it told him everything. A groom should be the second person every eye finds, after the bride. But the great reception hall of the Okonkwo estate was a forest of raised phones and tilted heads. And every face was pointed the other way, toward the long velvet aisle, toward the gold-draped high table, toward the place where the wealth of the evening had been arranged like fruit for the eye. Emeka walked along the edge of the crowd in his plain cream caftan, the one he had pressed himself that morning with an iron borrowed from the gateman. And the river of perfume and laughter closed behind him as though he had never entered at all. He did not mind. He had practiced not minding for the better part of a year, the way a man practices holding his breath before he learns he can hold it longer than he believed. He found the place reserved for him near the front, a single chair beside the canopy where he was meant to sit until the priest called the couple forward. And he lowered himself into it and folded his hands and waited for his own wedding to begin. A young usher in a borrowed waistcoat passed close, checking the name cards on the front row, and his eyes snagged on the empty chairs beside Emeka. "Sir, are these seats for your people?" the boy asked. "Your family should come up now before the priest." "I have no people coming," Emeka said. "It is only me." The usher blinked, then straightened, already losing interest, already looking past him to where the cameras were. "Ah, sorry, sir." And he was gone, and the single chair beside Emeka stayed empty, and he folded his hands again and let the small wound close. Above him, the chandeliers threw a hard, glittering light over the whole room. The Okonkwos had spared nothing. The walls were hung with white and gold, fresh roses had been flown in by the crate, and along the far wall a row of cooks tended pots that steamed with jollof and pepper soup and goat that had been slaughtered that dawn. Mama Adas, his own mother, had once stood at a pot like that for 30 years, selling akara from a stool at the mouth of a Lagos street so that her son could be educated far away. And she had died believing her boy was only a quiet, decent man who worked in an office and would one day marry a decent woman. She had not lived to see this hall. He was glad of that this one night. He was glad she could not see the way they had arranged the evening. For Emeka knew what no one else in the hall knew. He knew it the way a man knows the floor he is standing on, the marble under these dancing feet, the land this estate sat upon, the very loan that had built the new East Wing where the bride's family now received their guests. All of it ran, in the end, through a single quiet name on a single set of papers locked in a lawyer's drawer across the city. It ran through his. The Okonkwos believed they were marrying their daughter to a poor, pleasant nobody with a good heart and an empty pocket. They did not know that the nobody held the deed to the ground they stood on. He had never told them. He had wanted just once in his life to be loved for the cream caftan, not the keys behind it. He had nearly told them once. He remembered it now, sitting in the bright hall. 3 months passed. In the chief's study, the chief had leaned back, turning a glass in the light, and said almost idly, "Emeka, my son, what do you bring to my daughter? Be honest with me. Land? A house? Anything at all?" And Emeka had felt the words rise in his throat. "I bring everything, chief. I bring the ground beneath this house." And he had swallowed them. Because a love that needed the deed to be spoken before it would stay was not a love he wanted. So he had only said, "I bring my 2 hands and a faithful heart." And the chief had smiled a small, cold smile, the smile of a man filing something away, and said, "We shall see what those are worth." Emeka had not understood that night that the filing away had already begun. At the high table, the bride's father, Chief Okonkwo, rose with a glass in his hand, and the drummers softened, and the hall began at last to hush. "My people," the chief said, and his voice rolled out over them, warm and enormous. "Tonight my house overflows. Tonight my daughter, Adesi, the jewel of my old age, becomes a wife." The hall roared. Emeka watched the bride. She came down the aisle on the arm of an aunt, and she was very beautiful. And she did not look at him. Adesi Okonkwo wore a gown the color of fresh cream and a crown of coral beads that had been her grandmother's, and her face was painted with a soft, fixed smile that did not reach the rest of her. And Emeka, who had come to know her face over a year of careful visits, saw that under the powder she was frightened. Of what, he could not yet say. He had begun, in the last weeks, to fear that Ades did not love him. He had not let himself finish the thought. There was another Ades in that hall, and almost no one knew her name. She stood at the very back, near the door to the kitchens, in a faded green wrapper that had been washed so many times it had gone soft and pale at the folds. Her name was Adesi, too. It was a common name, the kind that means a daughter is precious. And the Okonkwos had hired her 3 days before the wedding to carry trays and refill water and disappear. She was 24, slender, with large, quiet eyes, and her hair bound up under a simple cloth, and a tiredness in her face that came from work and not from sorrow, though she had known her share of both. She had spent the afternoon carrying chairs in the sun, and she was the only person in that whole glittering hall who had ever looked at the groom and seen a man worth speaking to. It had happened the day before, in the dust of the side courtyard. Emeka had arrived early to help, because helping was in his hands and would not stay still. And he had bent to lift a stack of folding chairs the hired men kept leaving for someone else. The serving girl, Adesi, had come out with a tray and seen him struggling, his good kaftan graying at the knees. And instead of laughing, the men by the gate had laughed, calling him the broke groom, the charity husband. She had set down her tray and lifted the other end. "You should not be carrying these," she had said quietly. "Today you are the groom. Today I am only a man with 2 good arms," he had answered. And she had almost smiled. And they had carried the chairs together to the wall. When they set the last stack down, she had looked at his graying knees, and a small frown crossed her face. "You will ruin your good clothes," she said. "On a day like this, a groom should be sitting with his feet up while others run." "I am not good at sitting," Emeka said. "No," she agreed, studying him a moment longer than was polite. "I can see that. My father was the same. He could not watch another man work without his own hands itching." She picked up her tray again, but he died with clean hands. And she had gone, and Emeka had stood looking after her, turning that last sentence over, not knowing why it had lodged in him. Later she had brought him water without being asked, and a piece of bread wrapped in a clean cloth, because she had noticed he had not eaten. And she had said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, eat something. A man cannot stand on an empty stomach." She had not known who he was. She had thought he was poor. She had been kind to him anyway, and that small, unbought kindness had lodged in his chest like a coal that would not cool. He had thought about her all night and been ashamed of it, because tomorrow he was to marry another. Now the 2 Adesis stood at opposite ends of the same hall, the bride in cream and coral at the front, and the servant in faded green at the back. And the groom sat between them in his pressed kaftan, and the trap that the Okonkwos had built all these months was about to spring, though they believed, every one of them, that they were the ones holding the rope. Chief Okonkwo lifted his glass higher. "Glass, some of you," he said, and a sly warmth came into his voice. The warmth of a man about to give a gift he is proud of. "Some of you have wondered about the match. You have whispered, 'Do not think your father is deaf.' Laughter, knowing and indulgent. You have said, Chief, your daughter is a jewel. Why such a plain setting? Why this quiet young man with no name behind him, no land, no house of his own?" Emeka sat very still. "Tonight," the chief went on, "I answer you. Tonight I show you the love of a father." He turned and gestured to the great carved doors at the side of the hall, and at his signal they swung open, and a second drumming began, faster, brighter, and through the doors came a procession. A man walked at the head of it. He was perhaps 40, broad and gleaming, dressed in deep wine-colored isiagu, shot through with gold thread, a red cap on his head, heavy coral at his throat. Behind him came his people bearing gifts, bolts of cloth, a cooler of drinks held above their heads, and a man near the back carrying, on a velvet cushion, a fat envelope that did not need to be opened for the hall to understand it. Cameras swung toward the wine-colored man like flowers turning to the sun. "This," boomed Chief Okonkwo, "is Chief Donatus Ease. Some of you know him. His trucks move half the goods on the Eastern Road. His name opens doors in 3 states. The hall murmured, then surged. Donatus Easy raised a hand and turned in a slow circle so that all might admire him. And his smile was the smile of a man receiving what he came for. As he turned, his eye passed over the quiet figure in the cream caftan, and he lifted his chin and said across the few feet between them, not troubling to be quiet about it, "You, the one in the cheap cloth, be a good boy and move from the front chair. The man who belongs there has arrived." Emeka looked up at him. He did not move, and he did not speak, and the silence stretched one beat too long, and something flickered in Donatus Ease's face. Not quite unease, but the first faint cousin of it. "Did you hear me, errand boy?" Donatus said louder. "I heard you," Emeka said. "I am waiting for the chief to finish. He is speaking." And he turned his face calmly back toward the high table, leaving Donatus Easy standing there with his question unanswered. And the wine-colored chief covered the small sting of it with a laugh and a wave of his ringed hand. But he did not forget it. Emeka understood then. He understood the whole shape of it at once, the way you understand a wave is going to break the instant before it does, with no time left to move. "I have prayed on this," the chief said, and now his voice dropped, grew tender, performed. "I love my daughter. A father wants the best for his jewel. And when Chief Donatus came to me, 3 weeks passed, and laid his offer at my feet, when I saw what he could give her, the house, the cars, the security, I asked myself, what father, loving his child, would chain her to poverty for the sake of a promise made before he knew better? The hall had gone electric. They saw it now, too. They saw the gift the chief was giving, and a sound went up that was half gasp and half delight. The sound a crowd makes when a story turns, and the turn pleases them. "So tonight," Chief Okonkwo said, and he set down his glass and spread his arms wide. "Before God and before all of you, I crown a new union. My daughter Adaizi will not be wasted. She will be lifted. Chief Donatus Ease, come. Take your place. Let the right man stand beside my child." And the drummers thundered, and the hall rose to its feet. And 300 people who had eaten the Okonkwo's goat and drunk the Okonkwo's wine cheered the upgrade, cheered the swap, cheered the casting out of the quiet groom as though it were the finest part of the evening, which, to them, it was. Donatus Eze strode up the aisle. Adeze the bride did not move. Her painted smile stayed fixed. But her eyes, for one instant, found Emeka's across the noise, and in them he saw not love, and not even pity, but a kind of pleading helplessness, the look of someone being carried by a flood. Her lips moved, just barely, shaping two words that the noise swallowed, "I'm sorry." And then her father took her hand and placed it in the hand of the wine-colored chief. And the coral crown caught the light, and the cameras drowned them in their flashing. No one looked at the groom. Emeka rose from his single chair. He stood there a moment, a tall man in a plain-pressed caftan in a hall that had forgotten him. And 100 small cruelties passed over the faces nearest him, a smirk here, a man leaning to whisper behind his hand. A woman in bright Ankara who lifted her phone not to film the new couple, but to film him, the discarded one, so she might show her friends the face of the man who had been crowned and uncrowned in the same hour. A man at the end of the front row, an uncle of the bride with a heavy gold chain, said, "Just loud enough? Hey, charity husband, the show is over. The chief fed you free for a whole year. Take a plate on your way out, no shame in it." And the people around him laughed, the easy laugh of those who feel safe. Emeka looked at the man for a moment. "Thank you for the year," he said evenly. "I will remember every plate." And the way he said it, quiet and exact, made the uncle's laugh die in his throat, though the uncle could not have said why. He did not shout. He had imagined this moment more than once in the last weeks, as the chief's calls grew colder and the visits grew strange, and in every imagining he had a speech ready, a single sentence that would split the floor open and bring the chandeliers down on all their heads. He had only to say the name of his lawyer. He had only to name the loan. He had only to ask Chief Donatus Eze whether his trucks would still move on the eastern road, when the man who owned the road beneath this hall decided otherwise. He said nothing. To say it now, in front of 300 phones, would be to make himself exactly what they believed money makes a man: loud, vengeful, hungry to be seen. It would be to win the way they understood winning. And standing there in the roar, Emeka understood that the deepest thing his mother had given him, stirring Akara at the mouth of a Lagos street for 30 years, was not the money that had come later. It was the spine that did not need a crowd to know its own worth. So he closed his mouth. He inclined his head once, a small bow toward the high table, that no one but the serving girl at the back even saw. And he turned, and he walked down the long side of the hall toward the doors, alone through the cheering. And the cheering did not even pause to mark him going. But one person moved. At the back, by the kitchen door, Adeze the servant set down her tray of water glasses on the nearest table without a sound. She had watched the whole thing with her hand pressed flat against her chest. She had seen the kind man from the courtyard, humiliated in front of the world, seen him bow to the people who had spat on him, seen him keep a dignity that the wine-colored chief in all his gold did not possess and never would. And as Emeka reached the doors, she stepped out from her place against the wall, into the path of the discarded groom, and held out the same cloth-wrapped bread she had carried in her apron all evening because she had been too busy to give it to him before. "You did not eat," she said simply. Her voice shook a little. "A man cannot stand on an empty stomach." Emeka stopped. The noise of the hall was behind him, a wall of joy at his back, and in front of him was one tired young woman in a washed pale green wrapper, holding out bread with both hands, the only person in 300 who had crossed a room to reach him on the worst night of his life. He took the bread. Their hands touched for the length of a breath. "Thank you," he said. What is your name? Adaize, she said. And then, because it seemed absurd to share the name of the bride, she gave a small, broken laugh. I know. The other Adaize gets the crown, I get the trays. No, Emeka said quietly, looking at her in a way that made her go still. I think you have it the wrong way around. Behind them, a voice cut sharp across the kitchen door. Adaize! It was the head steward, a stout woman with a list in her hand, her face pinched with the panic of a big night. Why are you talking to a guest who is leaving? The high table needs water. Move yourself. The serving girl flinched and took half a step back toward her trays. It is my fault, Emeka said to the steward, mild as ever. I stopped her to ask the way out. Forgive me. And the steward, mollified, bustled off. And Emeka looked back at the girl one last time, and in the look was a whole sentence he did not say. And then he went out through the great doors into the dark, leaving her standing there with the noise of the wrong wedding crashing behind her and her own heart pounding for reasons she could not yet name. Now, before this story goes any further, before the papers come out of the drawer, before the proud are shown what they have done, let me ask you to do one small thing. If you believe a quiet man's worth should never be measured by the loudness of his pockets, take one moment and subscribe to this channel so that stories like this one always find their way back to you. Now, come with me, because what happened in the 7 days after that wedding is the part the Okonkwo's will tell their grandchildren in whispers. For 3 days, nothing happened, and the silence frightened Chief Okonkwo more than he would admit. He had expected, in the first hours, that the cast-off groom would come back. They always came back, the small men. They came back wheedling or weeping, or with a lawyer of their own making empty threats, and a man like the chief knew how to handle all three. He had handled smaller men his whole life. But Emeka did not come back. He did not call. He sent no message, no cousin, no aggrieved uncle. He simply vanished, the way a stone vanishes when it drops into deep water. And the only sign that he had ever been part of the family was the absence where his name had been. On the second day, a small thing happened that the chief paid no mind to, and should have. A man in a plain suit came to the gate and asked, very politely, to see the survey markers along the eastern boundary, saying he was from a chambers in the city confirming the property's pegs. The gateman, the same loud one who had refused to lift the folding chairs, let him in without a thought. And the man walked the boundary for an hour, checking each iron peg against a folded paper, making small marks, then thanked the gateman and left. The gateman mentioned it to no one. It did not seem worth mentioning. It was only much later that anyone understood the quiet man had been confirming that every peg sat exactly where the deed in the drawer across the city said it should. On the fourth morning, the first letter came. It was carried to the estate by a courier on a motorcycle and addressed not to the chief but to the bank, to the manager of the eastern branch where the Okonkwo accounts had been kept for 2 generations. The chief learned of it when his own manager, a careful man named Mr. Anine, called him with a voice that had lost all its usual oil. Chief, Anine said, the facility, the loan against the estate, it has been called. Called? Chief Okonkwo was at his breakfast, and Donatus Eze was beside him, for the wine-colored chief had moved himself into the estate as comfortably as if he already owned it. Speak plainly, Anene. What facility? The construction loan, chief, the one that built the east wing, the one secured against the title to the land. Anane paused, and in the pause was the sound of a man reading a paper he did not understand and did not like. It has been bought, the whole debt, by a private holder, and the new holder has called it. The full sum is due in 7 days, or the security is forfeit." The chief laughed, but it was a thin laugh. 7 days. This is some clerk's error. Who would buy my debt?" "That," said Anina, "is the part I cannot explain. The papers are clean. The transfer is real. But the name of the new holder is held behind a company, and the company is held behind a trust, and the trust—" He hesitated. "The trust is administered out of a chambers I have only heard of once before. Chief, this is not a clerk's error. Someone has prepared this for a long time." The sum, when Anand finally read it aloud, made even Chief Donatus Ezi set down his cup. It was 800 million naira. Donatus Ezi rose and walked to the window and looked out over the new east wing with its wide white pillars he had so admired only days before, and said slowly, "Whose ground am I standing on?" "Okonkwo." And the chief had no answer, and the silence that followed was the first crack in the wine-colored chief's certainty. There was a clock now in the Okonkwo estate that had not been there before. And though it had no face and no hands, every man in the house could hear it. 7 days. The chief had built his whole life on the certainty that he was never the smaller man in any room. And now an invisible larger man had reached into his accounts from somewhere across the city and squeezed. And the chief did not know who, and that not knowing was a kind of fever. He spent the 5th day on the telephone. He called in favors. He called the men who owed him, and found, to his cold astonishment, that several of them had stopped answering. He called a banker he had known for 20 years, a man who had taken his Christmas gifts every year without fail. And the secretary said the Oga was in a meeting, and would be in a meeting, it seemed, for the rest of the week. He called Donatus Ezi's bankers about a bridging loan, and Donatus Ezi, who had come to the wedding to gain an estate and a beautiful young wife, began for the first time to wonder whether the estate was as solid as the bride. That same afternoon, the two chiefs quarreled. "You told me," Donatus said, his finger jabbing the air, "that this land was free and clear, that your daughter came with a house and an estate and a name. I did not bring my cloth across 3 states to marry into a debt." "The land was free," the chief said, but his voice had lost its rolling certainty. "This is some trick of that." He stopped. "Of who?" Donatus pressed. "The boy in the cheap cloth you swore was a beggar you kept out of pity? Is a beggar reaching into a bank and lifting 800 million as easily as you lift a cup?" The chief said nothing, and that nothing was its own kind of answer, and Donatus Ezi sat back down heavily. And somewhere in the great house the bride sat alone and listened to her father's empire begin to make a sound she had never heard it make before. The sound of fear. By evening, the 800 million had a name beginning to form behind it, because Anen, pressed and frightened, had finally traced the trust to a lawyer, and the lawyer to a single private client. And when he spoke the client's name down the phone line, the chief felt the floor of his fine new east wing tilt beneath him. "It cannot be," Chief Okonkwo said. "It is his signature, Chief," Aneni said. "Emeka, the quiet one, the groom." For a long moment the chief said nothing at all. He thought of the cream caftan pressed by hand. He thought of the borrowed iron. He thought of the man carrying folding chairs in the side courtyard while the gateman laughed at the charity husband. He thought of his own words in the dark study. "What do you bring to my daughter?" And of the quiet answer, "I bring my 2 hands and a faithful heart." And he understood now that it had not been the answer of a poor man at all, but of a man who had something so large he did not need to say it. And he understood, with the slow horror of a man who has cursed the dark and finds he has been cursing the sun, that the poor nobody he had cast out had owned the ground under his feet the entire time, and had said nothing, and had let himself be humiliated rather than purchase his dignity with a threat, and that this restraint, which the chief would never in his life have managed, was the very thing that should have warned him what kind of man he was dealing with. "Bring him to me," the chief said. "Whatever it costs, bring him here." But Emeka would not come to the estate. That much pride he allowed himself. He sent word through the lawyer that if Chief Okonkwo wished to speak, the chief might come to a particular office in the city on the 7th day at noon and not before, and that he should come alone, and that he should come on time, because at 1 minute past noon the matter would no longer be open to discussion. Word of the falling clock spread, as such things do, beyond the walls of the estate, and it reached the kitchens, and it reached a serving girl who had been kept on to clear the last of the wedding's borrowed plate. Adais had not slept well since the wedding. She told herself it was the work. She had thought about the man at the doors more than was sensible for a woman who had spoken to him for the length of 2 short conversations and would never see him again. When the whispers ran through the compound that the broke groom had not been broke at all, that he had held the family's fate in his hand the whole time, that he had bought their debt and was going to break them on the 7th day, she felt 2 things at once, and they did not agree. The first was a fierce, secret gladness, because the chief had been cruel and proud and had earned what was coming. The second was a fear she could not explain, and it was a fear for him. She remembered the look on his face as he walked through the cheering. A man who had been hardened by money would have walked out grinning, already counting his revenge. Emeka had walked out grieving. And she found she did not want the gentleman from the courtyard to spend his one chance at being seen turning himself into the very thing the Okonkwos already thought he was. It was while she was clearing the last of the plate that she found the thing that decided her. Sweeping under a table in the half-forgotten gift room, her broom struck something soft, the cloth-wrapped bread, a second piece she had set aside that night and lost. She picked it up, gone hard as stone inside the clean cloth. And she thought, a man who took the first one, like it was the only true thing in that golden room, should not be alone on the day he wins. And the next morning, she put the hardened bread in her wrapper and made up her mind. On the 6th night, she did a thing that was not her place to do. She found the lawyer's office. It was not hard. The whole compound was buzzing the address like a curse, and she went there in the cool of the evening in her one good wrapper, the green one gone soft and pale at the folds. And she sat on the bench outside until the clerks left, and she waited because she had nothing to offer but waiting. And at last, a tall man in a plain shirt came out alone into the dusk and stopped when he saw her, as a man stops when the one thing he had stopped hoping for is sitting on a bench in front of him. "You," Emeka said. "Me," said Adais, and stood and twisted her hands in her wrapper, suddenly ashamed of her boldness. "I should not have come. I know it is not my business. I only—" She stopped and made herself begin again, because she had walked too far to lose her nerve now. "They say you are going to ruin them tomorrow. The chief. The whole house. They say true? Then I came to ask you not to." He went very still. "You came to defend the people who humiliated you with their trays and their leftovers?" "No." She lifted her chin. "I came to defend the man who carried chairs in the dust because he could not stand to see them left for someone else. That man would not enjoy ruining anyone. I do not want tomorrow to take him from me, from the world," she corrected quickly, flushing. I do not want the kind man to become a hard one just because the hard ones deserve it. And if I told you, Emeka said slowly, that they earned every bit of what is coming, that the chief asked me to my face what I was worth and decided the answer was nothing, that the man in the wine-colored cloth ordered me out of my own chair like a houseboy in front of 300 people, I would say all of that is true, Adaize answered. And I would still ask you. Because a man does not become clean by washing in another man's dirt. She drew a breath. My father, the well-digger, used to say that. He died with nothing but the respect of every man who had drunk from his wells. I would rather you had his nothing than the chief's everything. For a long moment, Emeka looked at her in the failing light. This servant girl who had nothing, who stood to gain nothing, who had walked across the city to plead not for the proud and not even for herself, but for the soul of a man she barely knew. And something in his chest, the coal that had not cooled since the courtyard, glowed up bright and steady. She reached into her wrapper then and brought out the cloth and unfolded it and showed him the bread gone hard as stone. It was meant to be yours that night, the second piece. Only I lost it. It is no good to eat now. But I carried it here so you would know. I did not give you bread because you were poor. I gave it because you were hungry, and no one else had looked at you long enough to see it. Whatever you are tomorrow, rich or ruined, you will still be the man who was hungry in that room. Emeka took the hardened bread from her and held it in both hands as if it were worth more than the 800 million he was owed. Sit, he said, his voice rough. Let me tell you what I am actually going to do tomorrow, and then you can decide whether you still wish to stop me. She sat. He sat beside her in the dusk, and he told her quietly. And as he spoke, her face changed. And by the time the streetlights came on, she was no longer afraid for him at all. Noon on the 7th day came hard and bright. The office Emeka had chosen was a plain one, a long table, white walls, a wide window letting in the merciless midday light, and on the table, a single folder. He had chosen it on purpose. He wanted no gold in the room, no throne, nothing for the chief to read his theater. He wanted only the table, the folder, and the truth, sitting in the light where it could not be argued with. Chief Okonkwo did not come alone, of course. Such men never do. He came with Donatus Eze beside him, because the wine-colored chief had decided his investment must be protected. And he came with the bride, his daughter Adaize, because, he had told himself, her beauty might soften the young fool, might remind him of what he had lost, might be the last card to play. And he came, without knowing he did so, with one more person in his train. The serving girl had been told to carry the chief's bag and open his doors. And so Adaize, in the same soft, green wrapper she had washed and pressed by hand the night before, slipped into the room behind the great ones and stood against the wall, where she belonged in their eyes, and where she could see everything. Emeka rose when they entered. He did not smile, and he did not gloat. "Sit, Chief," he said. "We have very little time, and I would not waste yours." Donatus Eze did not sit at once. He stood looking at Emeka with the careful expression of a man recalculating a sum he had thought was finished, and at last said, with a stiff dip of his head, "We met at the wedding. I did not know who I was speaking to." "You spoke to a man in cheap cloth," Emeka said. "I am the same man. Nothing about me has changed since that night. Only what you can see has changed. Sit down." And Donatus Eze, who had never in 20 years been told to sit down in such a voice, sat down. The chief sat. He had prepared, on the long drive, a great many things to say. apologies dressed as misunderstandings, flatteries, offers. And he opened his mouth to begin the first of them. "I have a confession to make to you," he said, spreading his hands, summoning all the enormous warmth of the wedding night voice. "A father's heart can be foolish. I see now I judged a book by its cover. If I had known—" "If you had known I was rich," Emeka said, "you would not have crowned another man at my wedding." "Yes, I know. That is exactly the problem, Chief. And I want you to hear it once, clearly. So we are not confused. The wrong thing you did was not failing to know my worth. The wrong thing you did was deciding a man without worth could be thrown away." The room was silent. Donatus Eze shifted in his seat. The bride Adeza stared at the table. "The loan," the chief said, abandoning the warmth, going to the only ground he understood. "Name your price. You called the debt to punish me, I understand. A man must answer humiliation with humiliation. It is the way of the world. So, what will it cost me to make this go away? I am a reasonable man. We can be family yet." "Open the folder," said Emeka. The chief hesitated, then drew it toward him and opened it. He read. The blood went slowly out of his face as he read, and the Eastern Road chief beside him leaned over to read also, and his gleaming confidence began, line by line, to dim. "This is the deed," the chief whispered. "That is the deed to the estate," Emeka agreed. "The land your house sits on. The land my company has held the charge over for 2 years, since before I ever met your daughter, since before you ever heard my name. You did not lose this to me last week, Chief. You lost it the day you decided to build a wing you could not afford and borrow against ground you did not truly own. I only happened to hold the other end of the rope. Then take it." The chief's voice cracked. "Take it and be done. Why drag us here? Why the 7 days, the clock, the theater, if you only meant to take the land?" And here was the moment. Emeka had thought about it for 7 days. He could feel, against the far wall, the serving girl watching, and he could feel the man he wished to be standing just behind the man he could so easily become. "Because I am not going to take it," he said. The chief looked up. So did Donatus Eze, sharply, and the bride lifted her head from the table for the first time. "Read the second page," said Emeka. The chief turned the page with a trembling hand. There was a new document beneath the deed, freshly drawn, the ink barely a day old, and it bore Emeka's signature and a space, still empty, for another. The chief read it twice before he understood, and when he understood, he made a sound that was not quite a word. "It cancels the debt," Anene's voice said in the chief's memory. But it was Emeka who said it aloud, gently, in the bright room. "Every naira of it. The 800 million. It transfers the deed back to your name, clean, with nothing owed. I am giving it back. The house, the land, the East Wing, all of it. There is no price. There is no condition that touches your pocket." Donatus Eze, who had come to harvest an estate, looked from the paper to the quiet man and back, and could not make the numbers mean what they meant. "No man does this," he said, half to himself. "No man holds another's throat in his hand and then opens his fingers. There is a trick in it." "There is no trick," Emeka said. "Only a thing you were never taught, that a man who cannot believe in a gift will spend his whole life poor in the middle of his money." "Why?" the chief breathed. "Because the night you crowned another man in my place," Emeka said, "you taught 300 people that a man's worth is the weight of his pocket. I could spend the rest of my life proving I had the heaviest pocket of all. I could take your house and your name and watch you carry trays at someone else's wedding. and I would have proved you right. I would have shown that the only thing that ever made me worth anything was the money you could not see. He shook his head slowly. I would rather show you that you were wrong about everything. So I give you back the money, and I keep the only thing I came here for. He turned, then, away from the proud men at the table, and looked across the room to the wall, where a servant girl in a faded green wrapper stood with her hand pressed to her chest. "A days," he said. Both women looked up, the bride in her fine clothes at the table, and the servant against the wall, for they shared the name. And the whole room understood, in the held breath of that doubled name, which Adaez he meant, and the understanding rearranged everything. "Not you," Emeka said to the bride, not unkindly, and there was no triumph in it, only a closing of the door. "You were never unkind to me, but you were ashamed of me. When your father crowned another man, your face begged me to understand, but it did not beg me to stay." The bride looked down, and a tear cut a clean line through her powder, and it was, perhaps, the first honest thing her face had done in a year. "I forgive you that," Emeka said. "Marry where your heart is free." But it was not with me, and we both knew it before the drums began. The bride Adaeze drew a slow breath, and then she did a thing that surprised even herself. She looked her father full in the face, in front of all of them, and said, "He is right, Papa. I was ashamed of him because you taught me to count a man the way you count cattle." Her voice shook but did not break. "I am done counting." And she did not look at the floor again. Emeka crossed the room. He stopped in front of the serving girl, and in the bright window light, the difference between her faded wrapper and the bride's lace meant nothing at all. "You carried chairs you were not asked to carry," he said quietly, only for her, though the whole room strained to hear. "You brought bread to a man everyone else had thrown away. You came across the whole city to beg me not to lose my soul for the pleasure of breaking the people who broke me. You did not know I had a single naira to my name, and you treated me like a king anyway." He took her hand, the same hand that had once held out bread, and her fingers trembled in his. "Marry me, Adaeze, not the one who was crowned, the one who carried the trays. I think you had it the wrong way round, and I would like to spend my life setting it right." The serving girl Adaeze, who had nothing and had asked for nothing, looked up into the face of the man from the courtyard, and the answer in her eyes did not need a crown to be understood. Chief Okonkwo, at the table, had risen halfway from his chair. The folder lay open before him, the cancelled debt and the return deed catching the noon light. 800 million naira of mercy he had done nothing to deserve. And beside it, the small green-wrapped truth that he had hired 3 days before the wedding and never once looked at. He opened his mouth. Of all the things he might have said, what came out was the smallest and the most true. "I did not see her," the chief said. "She carried my bag this morning. I did not even see her face." "No," Emeka said. He did not say it cruelly. He turned at the door with the serving girl's hand in his, and he looked back at the proud man one last time, and he gave him the only sentence he had carried in his chest through all 7 days of the clock. Not a threat, not a price, but the thing that would follow Chief Okonkwo into every quiet hour for the rest of his life. "That was always your trouble, Chief," Emeka said. "You spent your whole life learning to count what a man is worth, and you never once learned to see it." And he led Adaeze out into the light. The story does not end at the door, because the people who waited outside it deserve to be seen too. The news ran through the Eastern Road faster than any truck Donatus Easy owned. By evening, the men who had laughed at the gate, the ones who had called Emeka the charity husband, the broke groom, the one the chief took out of pity, heard whose ground they had been laughing on, and one by one, a strange procession began. They did not come all at once. They came the way the proud always come when they have wronged the wrong man, one by one, in order of how loudly they had laughed. The first to come, that very night, was the loudest gateman, the one who had refused to lift the folding chairs, the same one who had let the quiet man in the plain suit walk the boundary and never thought to ask why. He came to the lawyer's office with his cap in his hands and his eyes on the floor, and said he had not meant the words, that they were only the way men talked. And Emeka said, "Tell me one thing first. 3 days ago you let a man walk my boundary with a clipboard. Did you not wonder, even once, whose land it truly was?" The gateman's mouth opened and closed. "No, Oga," he admitted at last. "I never wonder. It is easier not to." And Emeka gave him work, real work, on the estate's new accounts, with a wage that fed the man's children, and said only, "A man who carries chairs for himself should learn to carry them for others. And a man should learn to wonder. You will get your chance at both." The gateman wept, and went away changed, and that was the whole of his punishment, which was the heaviest of all, for he could never again pretend not to know what kindness cost. The next to come, 2 days later, were 3 of the women in bright Ankara who had lifted their phones to film the discarded groom. They came together for courage, not to apologize but to be seen apologizing, and Emeka knew the difference and met them at the gate himself and did not let them in. "You filmed a man on the worst night of his life, so your friends might laugh," he said. "And now you have come so the same friends might see you forgiven. Go home. When you have wept where no camera can find you, your apology will be worth accepting." And he closed the gate gently, and they stood in the road a long while. And it is said that 2 of them became kinder women afterward, and one of them did not. Which is the way of these things. Chief Donatus Ease did not come at all. He did the arithmetic the moment the deed went back into Okonkwo hands, and found that a returned debt is a man who can return it again. And he left the city within the week and married elsewhere, and was never spoken of in that house again, except as a warning. And the bride, the first Adais, the one who had been crowned, she did not marry where her father pointed, not ever again. She left the estate within the month, against her father's storming, and went to the man her heart had been free with all along, a teacher with empty pockets and warm hands. And she lived modestly and, by all accounts, gladly. She wrote one letter to Emeka, a year on, and it said only, "You showed my father what worth was, but you showed me what freedom was, and I will thank God for it every day of my life." He kept the letter. He did not show it to anyone but his wife, for Emeka did marry, and not in a hall of 300 phones. He married Adais, the one who carried the trays, in a small church in the village where his mother had been born, with the old women of the parish singing, and a single drummer, and no cameras at all. And Adais came down the short aisle not in cream and borrowed coral, but in a gown the deep red of glowing embers, sewn with 1,000 small lights that caught the church candles and threw them back. A red sequin gown that a quiet man had chosen because he wanted the whole world, for once, to be unable to look away from her. The coral at her throat was real, and it was hers, given freely, and the gold at her wrists was her own. And she descended the few worn steps of that village church like a woman descending a grand staircase, because the grandeur was never in the marble. It had always been in her. On the morning of that small wedding, Emeka gave her one gift before she dressed. When she unwrapped the clean white cloth, she laughed, and then she wept, because it was the hardened bread she had carried to the lawyer's bench. He had kept it, dried and mounted now, in a small dark frame, with 4 words on a brass plate beneath. A man was hungry. "So we never forget what brought us here," he said. "Not the 800 million. This." And she hung it all her life, in whatever room they ate in, where every guest could see it, and almost no guest understood it. And she kept her trays. That was the thing the village remembered most about the new wife of the man who owned the Eastern Road. At the harvest feasts, she stood at the pots herself, in her fine clothes, ladling pepper soup for the widows and the gatemen's children, because she had not forgotten what it was to be the one the great ones did not see. And she did not intend ever to become a woman who could not see. Emeka would watch her from across the courtyard, in her red gown with a serving spoon in her hand, and the coal that had lodged in his chest in a dusty courtyard a long time ago would glow up warm and steady. And he would think that of everything he owned, the land, the road, the 800 million he had given away in a bright room. She was the only thing he had ever truly chosen. So remember this. Wherever you are sitting tonight, in whatever city has carried this story to you, the world will spend its whole life learning to count what you are worth, and it will get the sum wrong every time. Because the proud crown, the loud and the rich and the gleaming, and they cannot see the woman carrying bread to a man at the door, and they cannot see the man pressing his own cream caftan with a borrowed iron. But God sees. God exposes the proud in the fullness of time, and lifts the humble in the sight of the very people who scorned them, and sets a quiet kindness at the head of the table where the gold once sat. The Okonkwo's learned it in a bright room with a folder open on a table. May we be the kind who learn it sooner, and carry the chairs no one asked us to carry, and bring the bread, and look, truly look, at the ones the world walks past. For the crown was never on the head it shone upon. It was on the head that bent to lift another, and that crown no man can ever take away.